to actually voting on the bill. You still need 60 votes to clear that ending. And then if that goes forward, then you'll actually vote on the bill itself.
And we will end there because they're gaveling in now for their morning hour session. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Washington, D.C., January 8, 2014. I hereby appoint the Honorable John J. Duncan, Jr. to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 7, 2014, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, and with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. There are so many acts of success of our government that many of us know is the greatest nation in the world. Through the years, we've had great leaders who have recognized that government can work on behalf of the American people. Today, we commemorate the 50th year of the War on Poverty. And I thank my good friend Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who will be holding a commemoration in recognition not only of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who declared war on poverty, but also the many workers and many presidents since who in many aspects helped to build on the nation's safety net. Today, however, we find ourselves in a dilemma, not recognizing and accepting success where it is. Poverty has fallen significantly over the last half-century. Since the mid-1960s, average incomes among the poorest fifth of Americans have risen significantly. Infant mortality has dropped sharply, and severe child malnutrition has largely disappeared, but it still exists. In parts of my 18th congressional district in Texas, we have very high mortality rates. It means that our job is not over. Nearly 50 million Americans, however, were poor in 2012, including 13 million children, 60 million people live below half of the poverty line, and large racial disparities in the African-American community were clear and documented. And African Americans have a lower college degree graduate level than white Americans. And so the safety net has to be something for all of us. And as I borrow this from my good friend from California, just to show you a line of Americans possibly looking for work, we cannot point out and we cannot know at this point which one of these are near the edge of poverty or living in poverty simply because they cannot find work. And so it is important to note that there are elements that many discard. The Earned Income Tax Credit, Supplemental Nutrition Program, the huge job training and educational investment that President Johnson made on the war on poverty, Medicaid and Medicare, huge safety nets, not handouts, but safety nets. Maybe the word welfare should be changed to something of a transitional living fund, for that is what it is, for people to be able to live. There's been much maligning of the Affordable Care Act. Well, I'm here to announce today that close to 9 million people have now been a recipient and a victor in getting health care. 3 million young people have been able to stay on their parents' insurance. And we have seen the slowest growth in health care in 50 years. Safety net. And as well, we have people who will no longer have lifetime caps or pre-existing conditions preventing them from getting insurance, or those who work as roofers or laborers who, because of their work is difficult or dangerous, they cannot get insurance. Safety net, part of the overall picture of the war on poverty. And now we find ourselves in the midst of a debate about a transitional outreach to individuals who are chronically unemployed. And some would argue we should not do it. We should not do it when individuals who have looked for work actively, when there are 3 individuals per job. Some would say we need an offset. I consider it an emergency. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the people in my district and across America that are tired of partisan politics. And so why not a compromise? Why not a 3-month emergency extension and then a deliberation on the offset? Well, that probably will not be heard. So what is the offset? Why are we not in the midst of a combined discussion about what would be the most effective for all of the members to be able to vote on? Because it is documented that the unemployed are in everyone's district, 1.3 million that are chronically unemployed. Who is on the brink of poverty? Who is not able to secure a safety net? And let me just make mention of the Earned Income Tax Credit that has been a vital lifeline for many around the nation, but yet that is looked upon as a potential cut. It's too expensive. But these are lifelines, safety nets that President Johnson started. And frankly, of all the wealthy nations, we have the lowest safety net and the highest poverty because we're not willing to accept the fact that sometimes an American needs help, even a veteran, even a soldier. So today I honor the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty, Mr. Speaker, and I ask us to not give up the fight because the American people are looking to us to win the war. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, it's a new year. As the clock struck midnight, Americans throughout the fruited plain celebrated the end of 2013 and the start of a new year. January 1st, out with the old and in with the new. Light bulb, so saith Uncle Sam. That's right, turn out the lights, the party's over for the incandescent light bulb. I went to H-E-B last week in Texas and the shelves were bare. Only curly fluorescent light bulbs to be found. That's because the government has now banned the 75, 100, 60, and 40-watt incandescent light bulbs. Edison's light bulb has gone from the endangered species list to near extinction. Some incandescent light bulbs will be allowed, but only if they meet new government standards. What was once the symbol of the American innovation is now banned by the almighty government. Isn't that ironic? And why? Because it's not energy efficient, so saith the government. And the government certainly doesn't want Americans to have a choice with what light bulbs they purchase because the government knows best. The new fluorescent curly light bulbs, also called CFLs, contain mercury and also are more expensive. Mr. Speaker, I thought mercury was bad for us. Anyway, nothing gets easier when you use these light bulbs. You need to dispose of one of these curly light bulbs. Don't even think about throwing it in the trash without reading the instructions in the box. Don't throw them in the waste basket. You're supposed to take them to a local recycling center. Yeah, right. If a person decides to take the risk and throw the light bulb out at home, listen closely because, of course, it's more complicated. The light bulb should be sealed in 2 plastic bags and then placed in the trash outdoors so as not to pollute landfills if it breaks. There are more regulations. If a CFL is dropped, well, disaster strikes, in my opinion. You can't just pick up the pieces and throw them away. The EPA has generously told us in more detailed instructions what we do if one is broken. Quote, have people and pets leave the room and don't let anyone walk through the area. So, Mr. Speaker, if I accidentally drop this light bulb here on the House floor and it breaks, does that mean we have to evacuate the House floor? According to the EPA, at least we should do that. I give you more. Quote, open a window, don't have any in here, and leave the room for 15 minutes or more. Shut off the central heating and air conditioning system. Carefully scoop up the glass fragments and powder using stiff paper or cardboard and place them in a glass jar with a metal lid. Mr. Speaker, I hope you have some of those old mason jars around here. There is more. The EPA police say, quote, use sticky tape, such as duct tape, to pick up any remaining small glass fragments and powder. Wipe the area clean with a damp paper towel or disposable wet wipes and place them in a glass jar or plastic bag. Do not use a broom or a vacuum. Next thing you know, we're going to have hazmat come in to someone's home if they accidentally drop a light bulb. There's a lot more. Quote, these light bulbs may cause interference with radios, televisions, wireless telephones, and remote controls. Okay, I'll be sure and turn off the lights tonight when I watch Duck Dynasty because I don't want to miss it because I have these curly light bulbs. And I forgot to mention, guess where these little spiral light bulbs are made? China. Now, isn't that lovely? The power of choice has been taken away from the American people, even the choice of a light bulb, because government is controlling our lives and it knows better. The federal government should not have the authority to force Americans to buy anything, whether it's health care, a box of donuts, or even CFL light bulbs. As Willie Nelson has said, turn out the lights, the party's over. They say that all good things must end. Turn out the lights, the party's over for at least Thomas Edison's light bulb. So may it rest in peace, Mr. Speaker. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, today we mark the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, a dedicated legislative and policy effort by President Lyndon Johnson to reduce and eventually eliminate poverty in America. Yet despite the many successes of the War on Poverty, and there have been many successes over the past 50 years, there are those in this country and in this House who would destroy the programs that help people in need, those who have replaced the war on poverty with a new war on poor people. Unfortunately, that's what's happening right now with the Farm Bill. I'm honored to serve on the Agriculture Committee and as a member of the Farm Bill Conference Committee. I want and America needs a strong, comprehensive, forward-thinking bill. I represent farmers and farms, conservationists and agriculture research institutions. And like every other member of Congress, I represent people who rely on the nutrition programs in the Farm Bill to put food on their tables. That has been my primary focus as a conferee, to support and fight for the hungry in America. I believe the nutrition title, where SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, is authorized, is the most important part of the Farm Bill. This program provides food to 47 million food-insecure Americans, people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Food insecurity, Mr. Speaker, is another way to say hunger. These people are hungry, and they get food because they're on SNAP. We have been told that the House may vote on a Farm Bill conference report as early as next week. According to some reports, the bill would cut $8 billion from SNAP. Now, unlike the cut that took effect on November 1st, where all 47 million SNAP beneficiaries saw their benefits cut by an average of $30 a month for a family of 3, this $8 billion cut is more targeted. But that doesn't mean it's any less harmful. This cut would change the way SNAP benefits are affected when a beneficiary gets a LIHEAP benefit. Many have described the application of this SNAP-LIHEAP connection, sometimes called heat and eat, as a loophole. But calling this a loophole avoids the real issue at hand. The truth is that changing the way heat and eat works, closing the so-called loophole, will reduce an already meager benefit for millions of Americans, a benefit that didn't last a full month even before the November 1st across-the-board cuts took effect. Even worse, closing the so-called loophole would disproportionately affect poor seniors and the disabled, precisely the kind of Americans we should be looking out for during difficult economic times. There has to be a better way. SNAP has been cut twice to pay for other programs. First, to offset programs that help teachers, firefighters, and other social services, and a second time to offset improvements in the Child Nutrition Act. Now, these are good programs that deserve to be funded, although not at the expense of the hungry. I'm all for compromise when all sides negotiate in good faith. But why does compromise in Washington always mean helping those who are well off at the expense of the poor? Remember, Mr. Speaker, this cut will reduce the SNAP benefit by about $90 a month for heat-need households. 3 million poor families would see their food assistance cut by an average of $90 a month. And would these billions of dollars in cuts go back to helping other needy people? No. In a farm bill that continues to subsidize big agribusiness and special interest and further subsidize a crop insurance program that is rife with fraud, waste, and abuse, it's just one more cut to a program that helps our most vulnerable neighbors. Mr. Speaker, the November 1st cuts were devastating for 47 million hungry people. Just ask any food bank director in the country. Adding another $8 billion cut to another 3 million families will cause even more damage. Now, if my friends insist on changing the LIHEAP provision, then they should at least have the decency to reinvest those savings into SNAP. Both Democrats and Republicans are talking a lot these days about the issue of income inequality. That's a good thing. So why on earth would we pass a farm bill that makes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? We can and must do better. It is a scandal that in the richest country in the history of the world, we have a hunger problem. Members of Congress rush to the microphones to promote tax cuts and easing regulations on Wall Street. All the while, there are people in this country, men, women, and kids, who do not have enough to eat. I will oppose any farm bill that makes hunger worse in America, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. In conclusion, let me say to my colleagues, there are some things worth fighting for. Ending hunger, making sure our fellow citizens have enough to eat, is absolutely worth fighting for. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, you asked me to ask consent to revise the time.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the last few years, Ukraine has been working toward the signing of an association agreement with the European Union to increase economic and political ties with the bloc and solidify democratic values and principles. The association agreement was to have been signed on November 28th through 29th at an Eastern Partnership Summit meeting in Vilnius, Lithuania. On November 21st, the Cabinet of Ministers in Ukraine unilaterally suspended negotiations with the European Union due to excessive pressure from Russia. Outraged by this, Ukrainians began to protest by creating European squares, or Yevromaidans, across the country, including in the capital of Kiev. In the early morning on November 30th, the Ukrainian government sent a special forces to clear the Euromaidan in Kiev using physical force and tear gas, resulting in many protesters and journalists with traumatic injuries and several still unaccounted for. In response to the unprecedented use of force against peaceful protesters in Ukraine's history, several high-ranking deputies and officials in the governing party defected from the Party of Regions. Since then, protests have continued, with a reported 1 million Ukrainians taking to the streets on December 1st. Every Sunday since has brought at least 50,000 to the Yevromaidans. In the early morning of December 11th, special forces using chainsaws and metal batons broke through many makeshift barricades made of park benches and other available materials to encircle thousands of peaceful protesters in the Euromaidan in Kiev. In a 9-hour standoff with security forces, peaceful protesters of the Euromaidan stood their ground, singing the national anthem and praying every hour, with local churches ringing their bells in support of the protesters. In 2013, violence was used against more than 100 journalists in the Ukraine, and almost half of the incidents occurring in December. On December 25th, a well-known, respected Ukrainian journalist and civic activist, Tatiana Chernobyl, was brutally beaten on her way home. Protest leaders tie her beating to her anti-regime reporting. Her severely bruised face is now used as a symbol of government repression. The United States calls on the Ukrainian government to respect Ukrainians' freedom of speech and their right to free assembly, and to refrain from using force against peaceful protesters. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I saw the legislative agenda for this week was going to deal with the beleaguered Superfund program, I was encouraged. But when I saw what my Republican colleagues actually proposed, I was saddened and disappointed. Across America, we are plagued by a variety of severely polluted hotspots known as Superfund sites. Many are the legacy of past reckless or clueless business behaviors, and government itself shares responsibility as well. Local governments fail to properly zone and regulate businesses with toxic byproducts. Sometimes government itself created problems the way it operated sewer systems, solid waste management, and military operations. The Superfund law, created in 1980 with a Superfund tax on petrochemical industry that caused the problem, would provide cleanup funding. It was reasonable at that time, but it's been frozen in place for almost 20 years. In 1995, the excise tax expired. Neither the program nor the problems have gone away, and having fewer and fewer resources has not helped. Sadly, the proposals the House will be considering this week would actually reduce the overall amount of funding that's available, undercut standards, and slow cleanup. The federal government has created some of these problems, mostly military operations, which is the largest single source of Superfund sites in the country, but also situations like the TVA and its coal ash disaster. But instead of enhancing the federal commitment and capacity, this legislative exercise is an illustration of part of the problem. It's an attempt to look like we're doing something, but has no chance of being enacted into law, and if it did, it would actually make the problem worse. It's time for us to renew and refine the federal commitment, not complicate and undercut it. We should take a performance-based approach to zero in and will actually accelerate cleanup in a demonstrable fashion and be able to move away from what has too often been a pro forma response. The federal government should indeed clean up after itself and not leave the problem behind. The military should place Superfund cleanup a higher priority in its budgeting. We've seen recent studies about pollution around military bases like Camp Lejeune that has had a severe impact on military families and their neighbors, linking contamination to a series of birth defects like spina bifida, childhood cancers including leukemia. We should renew the Superfund tax, which I'll be introducing in legislation this week. The federal budget allocations should commit to cleanup, not passing the buck. We have settled into a program of sue, stall, and study as the inevitable result of a failure to work together to clean up, to protect the public, and save money in the long run. I hope we will reject the presentation today and instead make a renewed commitment to find ways to make it work better.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on December 26, 2013, President Obama signed into law the 2014 National Defense Authorization Act, which sets policy and funding levels for the U.S. Department of Defense. In large part, the bill went through regular committee order on the House side, with consideration of amendments from both Republicans and Democrats. A somewhat similar series of actions were taken by the Senate. Despite a small amount of political theater, both chambers ultimately found common ground and passed this important measure. By placing good policy before politics, members overcame differences and acted in the best interests of the country. In this case, to the benefit of our men and women in uniform. Mr. Speaker, this is how the institution is supposed to work. The measure offers our service members resources to safely fulfill their missions and the support that they deserve when they return from service. Now, I offer an amendment to the bill which passed as part of the final agreement. This will help improve the support we offer those who serve as they transition to civilian life, especially those coping with behavioral health injuries. Under the previous policy, service members and their families could utilize 180 days of health care coverage during the transition from military to civilian life through what is known as TAMP, Transitional Assistance Management Program. Unfortunately, post-traumatic stress and other behavioral injuries oftentimes do not present symptoms in some cases until 8 to 10 months until after leaving the military. Now, this can be overwhelming, if not debilitating, for an individual seeking to re-enter civilian life and start the next path. This amendment extends TAMP coverage by an additional 180 days for all services rendered through telemedicine. The amendment builds on a bill I introduced in 2011, the STEP Act, now Public Law 112-81, Section 713, which expanded federal exemptions for telehealth consultations across state lines by removing the individual state requirement that health professionals must hold licenses in the state where service member care is received. Healthcare professionals who are credentialed by the Department of Defense are now able to offer these services regardless of the patient's physical location. In addition, it allows military doctors to reach more patients and more patients access care without the stigma often associated with seeking treatment for the first time. If desired, such support can now be accessed from the comfort of one's own home through video teleconference, Skype, and a range of other telemedicine practices. In part due to this common sense change, in 2012, the Army was able to perform nearly 36,000 teleconsultations, which includes over 31,200 telebehavioral health clinical encounters. The numbers have continue to grow in 2013. For those burdened by physical and psychological injuries as a result of their service uniform, we must take every action to help them rebuild and become whole. Because of these policy changes, both of these policy changes are positive steps forward in modernizing how the Department of Defense delivers health care, making widespread telemedicine possible and accessible to those most in need. Mr. Speaker, Washington remains divided as we begin the second session of the 113th Congress, but I remain hopeful in knowing that bipartisan accomplishments such as this can serve as a guiding light for this institution in the weeks and the months to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the House to consider and pass emergency unemployment benefits for the 1.3 million long-term unemployed American workers. On December 28th, 82,000 Illinois workers' unemployment insurance expired. 38,000 of those workers are in Cook County and 5,000 more in DuPage. The Senate has agreed on a bipartisan basis to extend emergency unemployment insurance, and the House should act today to do the same. Opponents of extending emergency unemployment insurance may say, isn't the emergency over? Well, while the economy on the whole has improved, there is still an emergency, a jobs emergency. There are 2.9 million unemployed workers. There are 2.9 unemployed workers for every available job. Long-term unemployment is still at the highest rate we have seen in this country since World War II. Opponents of extending emergency unemployment insurance criticize the long-term unemployed, belittling their efforts to find work in this economy. For the worker out of a job for 27 weeks or longer, you have just a 12% chance of finding a new job within the month. These numbers continue to fall with each passing week. These workers face challenges to their health, their mental well-being, and often struggle with family relationships. I left Chicago yesterday, where Illinois has the 4th highest unemployment rate in the country. Yet I come to Washington to enact on unemployment insurance and jobs legislation. Instead of blaming workers, let us as members of Congress look in the mirror. What have we done to address the issue of long-term unemployment? Last year, we took dozens of votes to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, but we have done little to create jobs. We have done nothing to advance immigration reform, which will infuse over $1 trillion in our economy over the next 20 years and create jobs. We have done little to address the nation's long-term transportation needs by investing in infrastructure, which will create jobs. We have done little to invest in research and education, which will grow our economy and make us more globally competitive, all of which creates jobs. Instead of playing politics, let us take it upon ourselves to pass meaningful jobs legislation, and let us extend benefits to these workers in their time of need. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to share with you a story today from Liza Long. A year ago, Liza wrote about the difficulty she faces raising a son who suffers from serious mental illness. Quote, "I live with a son who is mentally ill. I love my son, but he terrifies me," she said. A few weeks ago, Michael pulled a knife and threatened to kill me and then himself after I asked him to return his overdue library books. His 7- and 9-year-old siblings knew the safety plan. They ran to the car and locked the doors before I even asked them to. I managed to get the knife from Michael, then methodically collected all the sharp objects in the house into a single Tupperware container that now travels with me. Through it all, he continued to scream insults at me and threatened to kill or hurt me. That conflict ended when 3 burly police officers and our paramedic wrestling my son into a gurney for an expensive ambulance ride to the local emergency room. The mental hospital didn't have any beds that day, and Michael calmed down nicely in the ER, so they sent us home with a prescription for Zyprexa and a follow-up visit with a local pediatric psychiatrist. This problem is too big for me to handle on my own. Sometimes there are no good options, so you just pray for grace and trust that in hindsight it will all make sense. I'm sharing this story because I am Adam Lanza's mother. I am Dylan Klebold's and Eric Harris's mother. I am James Holmes' mother. I am Jared Lochner's mother. These boys and their mothers need help. In the wake of another horrific national tragedy, it's easy to talk about guns, but it's time to talk about mental illness, end quote. Liza shared her story with my subcommittee last year at a forum of parents of children with severe mental illness. And after studying our nation's mental health system for the past year, as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Oversight Subcommittee, we discovered those families who need help the most are least likely to get it. And where there is no help, there is no hope. Federal programs meant to serve the severely mentally ill are failing. The federal government sets up barriers that make it increasingly difficult for mothers and fathers to care for a son or daughter coming of age who needs help for mental illness. Our current policies block or interfere with appropriate treatment. Funds are wasted on ineffective programs, and scientific standards are not used in determining where the money goes to for grants and treatments. Our current policies have replaced hospital beds with prison cells and homeless shelters as options for the seriously mentally ill. That's wrong, and that's immoral. And that's why I introduced the Helping Families and Mental Health Crisis Act, H.R. 3717, to deliver care to those with severe mental illness who need better treatment, real treatment, not excuses and not delays. Today, Liza's son is doing better with the proper diagnosis and medical care. She wrote about where things stand with reforming mental health this week, 13 months after her initial letter, and discussed the Helping Families and Mental Health Crisis Act. She said, "Considering our limited resources, it just makes sense to help those who are most in need. That was the rationale behind Helping Families and Mental Health Crisis Act." And she continued to call for what's needed to help our seriously ill children. She wrote, "Access to medical care for the 11 million people who suffer from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. This bill seeks to accomplish this goal by empowering parents, increasing acute care beds, and promoting assisted outpatient treatment for as many as 50% of schizophrenia sufferers, whose symptoms include anosognosia, or lack of awareness of their illness. The bill also addresses the critical shortage of child psychiatrists, where there's only one for every 7,000 children in the U.S., with funds for telepsychiatry, and seeks to reform SAMHSA by redirecting funds for community-based care towards evidence-based programs. The Wall Street Journal praised the bill, noting that SAMHSA, the government agency charged with funding community mental health treatments, has little or no focus on medically driven care, and of its 537 full-time employees, only 2 are physicians," end quote. Over the past month, I've received an enormous outpouring of support from parents and caregivers of loved ones who have serious mental illness. They know this bill takes mental illness out of the shadows of ignorance, despair, neglect, and into the bright light of hope. Each week, I'll come before the House and share more stories like Liza's. I encourage my colleagues to join me in this endeavor by sponsoring the Helping Families and Mental Health Crisis Act, H.R. 3717, because where there is real help, there is real hope. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I rise today as a member of the Safe Climate Caucus. Now, after 12 months of the 113th Congress, Republicans continue to push their anti-clean energy, anti-environment, climate-denying agenda. Although we've taken very few votes in this Congress over the past year, we've taken more than 100 votes that are anti-environment. 20 votes that would weaken the Clean Air Act, 20 votes that would prevent federal efforts to curb greenhouse gas carbon pollution, 51 votes to protect oil and gas special interests, 37 votes to weaken the Clean Water Act, and 27 votes to slash funding for clean energy and energy efficiency. Now, I don't enjoy pointing out that protecting our air and our water has become a partisan issue. But I must point out that Republicans are still sacrificing the climate and our environment for the benefit of a few wealthy special interests. Now, it's cold outside today in much of the U.S., and some are saying that this is proof that global warming is a hoax. How misinformed that is. The cold wave in mid-latitudes of North America is a result of warm patches in the oceans and the atmosphere diverting the jet stream and driving Arctic air southward. Climate change doesn't mean warmer air everywhere, every day. It means more fluctuations, or, in other words, droughts, storms, temperature changes. They are and will be greater. It's going to be warmer tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, for the next 100 years on average, until we get serious that this is the most pressing environmental threat to our planet, global climate change. The way we produce and use energy is the greatest insult to our planet, not only causing injury and death through pollution, but adversely changing the world's climate with very dangerous, deadly results. We should support the President's Climate Action Plan. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week, a news report revealed that a hospital in Houston, Texas, my home state, was unable to pay dozens of its employees during the holidays due to a new Medicare payment contractor. Nearly 150 employees, ranging from doctors to nurses to administrators, missed several scheduled paychecks because this hospital's Medicare payment facilitator is taking too long to process Medicare claims for reimbursement. Unfortunately, this is a growing problem, plaguing the medical facilities and hardworking employees across the country. That is why my bill, the Medicare Established Provider Act, should come to the House floor for a vote quickly. H.R. 3168 will help alleviate the reimbursement backlog by creating a trusted provider system. Like this hospital in Texas, there are many established Medicare providers with a proven history of timely, valid claims, and they should be rewarded with prompt reimbursements rather than put in limbo for months or years at a time. Allowing this bill to pass would allow companies and small businesses to expand and would streamline the process for these trusted providers. As the backlog of claims continues to rise, the livelihood of employees and businesses should not be put at risk. I hope this bill will get serious attention and bring common sense business principles to this industry. In God we always trust. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was a beautiful September day in 2001. I'm driving to work, and I hear the plane hits the World Trade Center. And I was a newly minted pilot at the time, a private pilot, and I remember thinking, how could a plane fly into a big building? And then I heard that another plane hit the other tower. And then eventually I heard one hit a field in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon, not too far from here. And I realized that America was a country under attack. It was under attack by an ideology that believes that anybody that believes different than their brand of theology is not just wrong, but that they're worthy of death. And in fact takes that belief and actually implements it by killing innocent men, women, and children, including folks of their own religious ideology. Mr. Speaker, as a result of that, America became a generation that went to war to defeat this ideology. I myself am a veteran of the wars and spent quite a bit of time in Iraq. And I've got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I heard the other day that Al-Qaeda, let me stress this, Al-Qaeda, America's #1 enemy, raised the black flag over Fallujah, over an area that the United States Marines, who have fought harder than they have since any battle since Vietnam, fought to achieve and take over and bring peace to Fallujah. Mr. Speaker, Al-Qaeda raised the black flag over Fallujah. This is an epic failure of American foreign policy and an epic resurgence of America's chief enemy. You know, in 2011, President Obama had an opportunity to make a decision about whether America would continue to show its support for a free Iraq, whether America would continue to be the intercessory between difficult back and forth and continue to bring people together in Iraq, as we did during the surge, which the President opposed. And we're finding out more information may have actually been for political reasons. Shocker. We're finding out, Mr. Speaker, that Al-Qaeda now has a town very close to Baghdad. This is a failure of American foreign policy. If you look into Syria, Mr. Speaker, you see a brutal dictator that kills people and has no compunction about killing innocent women and children just to maintain power. You see, in essence, he's become a strong partner to the United States in order to dechemicalize his country and take chemical weapons out of his arsenal. But yet, on the other part of Syria, you see not the moderate forces of opposition to Mr. Assad. You now see Al-Qaeda-related forces overpowering moderate opposition to Assad. And you see that because of America's foreign policy, which said we supported the Free Syrian Army, but in reality has not supported the Free Syrian Army. If you look in Egypt, you see the Egyptian people stand up and say, we don't want to have one dictator replaced by another. We don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to run our country and change our constitution. But we have no idea where the president's at in this. We've taken a very important ally in the Middle East and basically told him that we're not interested in their political future. You look at the instability in Lebanon. You look at the questions with the people of Afghanistan about what's going to happen post-2014 as America committed to defeating Al-Qaeda and to defeating the Taliban. I could go on and on. You look at the deal we have with Iran, basically giving Iran the option of continuing to enrich uranium. Mr. Speaker, 5 years ago, I could not have written a sadder story about where American foreign policy could be. Because what I see now in the United States is that our allies no longer trust us and our enemies no longer fear us. Mr. Speaker, the United States needs to use limited air power in Iraq to push Al-Qaeda back out of Iraq. We need strong intelligence assets to work with the government of al-Maliki to ensure that Al-Qaeda has no foothold in Iraq again. It is not too late to reverse the tragic foreign policy consequences of what we've seen in the Middle East. But, Mr. Speaker, this has to be done today. This has to be done now. The blood of Americans have sacrificed for a free Iraq and a free Afghanistan. We cannot let that sacrifice be in vain. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to call attention to and to stand in unyielding opposition to the latest push by the administration and some in Congress to subvert U.S. law that prohibits the United States from funding any agency at the United Nations that admits a non-existent state of Palestine to its membership. When UNESCO opted to grant Palestine membership to its ranks in October of 2011, it did so knowing full well that U.S. law mandated, we were obligated to cut off its funding. And they did it anyway. However, now the Obama administration is making a full-out push to not only restore funding to UNESCO, which will cost the U.S. taxpayer nearly $80 million a year. If you're listening there, think of $80 million of your hard-earned taxpayer dollars going to this UN institution, but also not only $80 million this year, but to pay nearly $250 million that we owe in arrears because the administration decided to remain in UNESCO. We could have opted to pull out of that disgraceful body and not have any late fees, but now it's $80 million to get in and $250 million for the late fees. Remember, this is the same UN that allows to sit on its Human Rights Committee regimes such as Cuba, China, Venezuela, and Syria. Yes, Syria, where the Assad regime has been responsible for the deaths of over 130,000 people during its tenure on the Human Rights Committee. These nations are human rights violators. They do a disservice to UNESCO, whose stated mission of peace through solidarity and the protection of basic freedoms is not being upheld. But what they really do well is push the strong anti-U.S. and anti-Israel agenda at UNESCO. And let's be honest, that is why they remain in their positions. Mr. Speaker, we must not equivocate. We must not mince words. We will not sit blithely by while some try to circumvent or undermine these laws to once again fund UNESCO. No! Giving the administration the authority it seeks to fund UNESCO would not only set a dangerous precedent by showing those with an anti-Israel agenda at the UN that the U.S. does not have the courage of its convictions, nor the fortitude to enforce our own laws, but it would also give the green light to the rest of the bodies at the UN to follow UNESCO's lead, to admit Palestine, thereby granting it de facto recognition to a non-existent state. This is a way for the PLO and its collaborators at the UN to use that body to gain statehood without having to first come to an agreement with Israel over the conflict. A vote to fund UNESCO in this body is a vote to undermine the peace process and any hope of resolving this issue. To my colleagues, I would say that you must not fall for the latest bamboozle trick that UNESCO is pushing by playing on your soft spots. What are they going to do? UNESCO is going to come to some of us and promise to highlight the great buildings in our districts, the monuments in our districts, the cultural sites in our districts, and say, well, they'll designate them World Heritage Sites. We'll bestow upon them official UNESCO designation of a heritage site. Just how gullible does UNESCO think members of Congress are? I think we will soon see. They want us to ignore U.S. law so that we can restore funding to UNESCO so that UNESCO can give us some of our own U.S. taxpayer dollars back. I implore my colleagues, please don't do this. Stand up for American principles. Stand up for U.S. law. Don't waste the hard-earned dollars of your constituents on an anti-American institution. UNESCO knew what fate awaited it when it admitted Palestine, and now it must reap what it sowed, or it must reverse its decision. It's easy. The choice is, as it has always been, UNESCO's to make. This is not just about principles. This is about convenience. UNESCO is betting that we only stand with Israel when it is convenient. UNESCO turned its back on Israel and the peace process. All UNESCO wants is our cash, our constituents' cash, and then it will continue to pursue its anti-U.S., anti-Israel agenda. Do you seriously think that your constituents want millions of their money to go to an agency at the corrupt UN that works against everything we try to do, to hurt our closest friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel? I don't think so. We are better than that, Mr. Speaker. So I urge my colleagues to stand firm and do the right thing. No waiver, no flexibility, no change to U.S. law, no funding for UNESCO. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The time of the gentlewoman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Well, the Arctic vortex blast coincided with the return of Congress to Washington, D.C. Wind chills well below zero. Now, no surprise, a number of my Republican colleagues who are dyed-in-the-wool climate change deniers and some of the blathering idiots on talk shows said, whoa, look at this, Arctic vortex proves that there's no climate change, there's no global warming, it's all a hoax. Well, I'd like to begin this new year with a little optimism and hope Congress will take on big challenges, some of the biggest challenges of our time, including
climate change, but the bizarre theories of the climate change deniers and the excuses they'll use probably preclude that. Now, given the overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change will spur more extreme weather events, yes, including record cold and Arctic vortexes with shifts in the jet stream, and droughts and a whole host of other things. We had about the driest year on record in the western U.S. this year in Oregon and California. You know, this is a serious challenge. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, this Congress, because of denial, is pretty much incapable of dealing with this challenge. Luckily, we do have an alternative, and that's the President's Climate Action Plan. And the fact that the EPA has been found to have the authority by the Supreme Court of the United States to regulate carbon emissions as pollution. And, you know, following through on the President's Climate Action Plan is critical to show the rest of the world that the United States can again lead on this issue, and we're serious about it, and use that leverage to bring other countries into line. Now, the EU and others are dealing with it, but there's a total denial in China. You know, back in 2005, the U.S. and China emitted about the same amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, about 7 million metric tons. 5 years later, U.S. is down a little bit. China's up to 10 million and growing every day. China must be part of this. Now, how are we going to get countries like China and others lined up on this? Well, I think we've got a strong tool. We can demand reductions. We can demand that trade agreements with these nations will level the playing field in many ways. We've ignored labor and the environment in many of these trade agreements. We can't put U.S. manufacturers at a disadvantage when they are dealing with climate change issues and carbon dioxide emissions, and the Chinese aren't, because we live, unfortunately, on the same planet as the Chinese, and they're destroying the world's climate very, very quickly. So even if we take strong measures here, we've got to force those measures on other countries. Now, I think that the trade agreements are an ideal place to do this. Unfortunately, the Obama administration is of two minds on this issue. One is, and I've been acting very forcefully to protect the President's authority to regulate carbon emissions and encouraging the EPA to go ahead with strong measures. The Republicans are attempting to overturn and preempt that authority, but it does exist. But unfortunately, in the office of the Special Trade Representative appointed by the President of the United States, they are busily undermining the President's climate change agenda. Yes, they are acting at complete odds with the Environmental Protection Agency. The European Union has adopted measures to to reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions from all fuels and transportation fuels included by 10% within a relatively short period of time. And one of those provisions would score the dirtiest sources of fuels as the way they should be for emitting more carbon. That would mean there would be a penalty against oil, gasoline, diesel extracted from tar sands, the dirtiest, most polluting way to obtain oil that anyone knows of. Now, the European Union is moving ahead, but now the President's Special Trade Representative, appointed by the President, somehow is saying that the EU shouldn't do this. The U.S. objects to that, and they're in league with Canada in attempting to overturn these steps by the European Union. The President needs to rein in his Special Trade Representative, and we need to protect and encourage the President to deal with this very serious issue.
The gentleman's time has expired. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the crime of human trafficking is complex and it's destructive. It shatters the lives of its victims and their loved ones. In an effort to bring attention to this modern-day form of slavery, we recognize January 11, 2014 as National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. This multi-billion-dollar criminal industry exists in every state. The statistics are stunning, and it is essential this National Awareness Day shed light on a human rights tragedy which occurs in every region across our nation. Though the impact of this crime affects men, women, and children, approximately 80% of all human trafficking victims are women, and nearly half are minors. Overall, there are 21 million individuals who are victims of forced labor and a $32 billion industry that is only second to drug trafficking as the most profitable form of international crime. Combating human trafficking requires commitment and cooperation at all levels of government and among agencies and among nonprofits. I see this collaboration taking root in my district in Pennsylvania. I was pleased to attend a meeting at Calvary Church in Souderton, teaming up with local nonprofit Worthwhile Wear, poised to address the issues of shelter and homelessness as they relate to human trafficking prevention and recovery. The county-wide Bucks Coalition Against Trafficking created a local resource to raise public awareness and help end this horrendous crime through community education, victim identification, and legislative change. The coalition has commemorated their one-year anniversary, and their outstanding achievements have been recognized by the County of Bucks. As the federal representative for Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and a member of the Victims' Rights Caucus, I'm working to support and pass federal laws to end this heinous crime through the introduction of bipartisan legislation that reflects the interests, rights, and the needs of victims. January 11, 2014 is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, but every day we must work together, forming a united front against human traffickers, and together we can raise public consciousness, prevent violence, protect the vulnerable, support survivors, and punish the offenders who perpetrate these crimes. I appreciate the time on the floor this morning, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
And the House returns today at noon Eastern to begin the first day of legislative work in the second session of the 113th Congress. Members will consider 3 bills, including one to eliminate auto dealer emission certification on light trucks, also continuing the National Toll-Free Poison Control Center hotline. Later in the week, bills dealing with the security of the healthcare.gov website and expanding state responsibility in cleaning up Superfund hazardous waste sites. We'll have live coverage when members gavel back in just over an hour at noon Eastern. Well, both House Democrats and Republicans met today in their conference and caucuses, and we hear next from the Speaker John Boehner after their meeting.